You are listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I am your host, Celine Yeager. Each week, I bring you advice from athletes, scientists, researchers, and other experts to help you feel and perform your best, no matter what your hormones are doing. This show is a production of Live Feisty Media. Hello, strong, feisty women. I hope you all are well. So I have gotten a few requests via the SpeakPipe voicemail system to do a show on arthritis. And that's a good one. We've done some on joint health for sure with Dr. Vonda Wright, but I've never really sat down and done a full show just on arthritis. And it's important because, as the saying goes, we're only as strong as our weakest links. And for many of us, that's our joints. And our joints do get more susceptible with age and through the menopause transition. So here we are. I am bringing you a show on arthritis. I hit up my friends at the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York, which is the #1 ranked hospital in the US for orthopedics. And they connected me with this week's guest, sports medicine physician, Dr. Ashley Austin. And man, she was awesome. She's not only an incredible doctor who specializes in treating women as well as acute overuse and chronic musculoskeletal injuries in joints like shoulders, hips, knees, hands, wrists, elbows, but she's also incredibly active herself. She played Division I basketball, and she still plays the game, along with tennis and soccer, snowboarding, surfing, home improvement projects, high altitude mountaineering and hiking, you name it. So she gets it. I really loved this conversation and all her sage wisdom and practical advice, and I hope you do too. So before we get to it, as always, give us a follow at Feisty Menopause at Instagram and Facebook. Join our private Hit Play Not Pause Facebook group, and make sure you head over to feistymenopause.com or go to the show notes in this podcast and sign up for our brand new Feisty 40 Plus newsletter, which not only features all the active news you can use, but also workouts each week from Dr. Carla DiGirolamo. We feature badass, feisty women like yourself, whole lot more. We're super proud of it. So sign up, totally free. Get it in your inbox. Just go to feistymenopause.com or hit up the show notes. Sign up today. Thanks as always for the continued great reviews and 5-star ratings. You all really know how to make a woman feel loved. I appreciate you. And quickly, before we get to it, if you haven't checked out our new sponsor, Lagoon Sleep, and done their sleep quiz yet, check it out in the show notes. Their personalized pillows are 100% dreamy. And really, I have come to appreciate how pillows are an incredibly underappreciated part of a solid night's sleep. Even if I go somewhere where the mattress is going to be like, I don't know, I take my pillow and it is amazing. So I am loving my cooling otter pillow. It actually does keep you cooler at night. It's amazing. So go there, check them out, take the quiz. Thank you, Lagoon, for your support. All right, enough of me. Let's have a few words from our awesome sponsors and get on with the show. Okay, Ashley, I am really, really excited to talk to you because this is, when you talk about an active population like we have, nothing bums them out more than joint pain. Like nothing. It's just, I mean, maybe cancer, okay, but like beyond like the big things, joint pain is the thing.
Definitely. No, joint pain is just, it's super tough because, especially working in sports medicine, people are using their joints to the fullest, to the max. They're not just, getting up and going to work and coming home, right? They have a lot of goals, they have a lot of plans, and they are really optimizing their body's capacity for work. And often the joints are the things that start talking to us and letting us know, when things are not necessarily going right. And we don't like that, because when joints hurt, we're not capable of doing the active things that we like to do.
100%. And before I go into it, I have to know, you have such an array of hobbies. You are a high altitude mountaineering person, hiking, playing tennis, basketball, and soccer, snowboarding, learning to surf. home improvement and reflective writing, which maybe doesn't use the joints. But like, do you still do all those things?
I do. So I actually recently had a kiddo about a year ago. So I had to slow down
Congratulations.
just a little bit after that. But I am just ramping right back up into all those things. And those are things that I enjoy, and it depends on the season. But I really am a big on just a variety of activities and a variety of different loading on the joints. So how I've kind of stayed healthy over this time is really varying my activity. I mean, the
Oh.
muscles and the way I'm using my joints when I'm playing tennis is very different than when I'm, climbing, mountains at altitude, which is very different than when I'm playing, pickup basketball. And so I think just not, my goal is not to overstress my body too much with one type of thing, and just making sure that all of the muscle groups that I want to be recruiting are kind of always ready to be working.
I love that. I'm so glad I asked because it's such a good answer. And how is surfing going? Because we have a lot of learning to surfers actually in the audience, and one that might want to learn how to surf.
Yes, I think one key point for learning to surf is, I think, having some grit. And grit is like this, concept of sustained, focus and, dedication to doing something. And I think grit, similarly with snowboarding, you're gonna fall a lot in the
Oh my
beginning.
God, you fall so
You,
hard.
you just have to know that's gonna happen.
Yeah.
And you really just have to, and you learn a lot about yourself. I felt like when I was surfing, truly. And I really have always loved swimming. So I think being a strong swimmer is also important. But I think it's really just like, people will give you a lot of different concepts and a lot of different ways to get out there. But really, you have to kind of feel your body. You have to feel the board. You have to, it's a lot of things linking up at one time. And you have to like have that confidence, like, even though it feels like you might fall, you can probably catch it, right? You can probably, like, trusting your balance and trusting your body's feel. So I think there's a lot of like mental aspect to surfing that I feel like, as a beginner, that I'm really like appreciating.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay, let's go. Let's go to arthritis. I think starting with the basics is important. Like I think we all have sort of a general idea of what arthritis is. It's like a degeneration of our joints, wear and tear. But like, what actually is it, and do we all get it?
I think this is a great question. And I have patients ask me this all the time because, everyone has heard the term arthritis, but not everyone actually understands, conceptually what's happening. So I think, the best way I can describe it is that we have cartilage in all of our joint, and cartilage are these smooth surfaces that allow our joints to glide over the top of each other while we're doing activity. And as our knee is like a hinge joint. So that movement's a little different than maybe, say our shoulder or hip that has that, rotational ability. And this cartilage over time breaks down. And this breakdown is a natural process of living. So I always tell my patients, my patients that come in their, in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, all the way through the stages of life, they'll ask me, do I have arthritis? And the answer is yes, you do,
Yes.
because you've lived this many years. So you absolutely do. Now, whether that, arthritis is affecting your day to day, or whether your body is doing a really good job of adapting to that, and whether you've trained your joints well enough to where it's not affecting you, that's another question. But whether you have it, I mean, it is a progressive process that really it can't be halted. It is always happening as long as we're putting weight and loading through our joints. But the speed that it happens can vary. And there are many factors that can, and we can talk about that a little later, but there's many
Yeah.
factors that can contribute to how that progression happens. But it is a progressive process that everyone gets in all of our joints.
Which leads beautifully to my next question that I'm sure you hear all the time. I hear it all the time. Um, the idea of, you talk about that, and people, like some people's mothers maybe might hear that you're wearing out your joints. Like, well, then the more I use them, the more I'm going to wear them out, right? So if I'm running, my knees aren't going to last as long as if I just sit here in this chair. But like research doesn't really bear that out. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Right. So it's almost this, concept of like too much of a good thing, right?
Mm,
So I think, exercise absolutely keeps our joints healthy. So this is like any moving and activity that's outside of our daily stuff to kind of like get to work and come home, right? I think about that as like the necessities of life, right? Taking care of our family, doing stuff around the house, that kind of stuff is like the normal daily life stuff. This is like our ADLs, or activities of daily living. And then there's a separate category that's exercise. And so, the way I think about it is, if my body is only trained to do my activities of daily living, then when I try to go exercise, your body doesn't know how to do that extra, right? So what exercise does is it actually strengthens our body for our activities of daily living and builds resilience in our joints so that those activities that we do don't really bother us. And actually we have the capacity to build more, to project to kind of protect our joints over our lifespan, right? And so I think about like, obviously, there's this category of like, I'm not doing enough in my joints. And there are a lot of things that happen we're doing that, right? We can have weight gain, we can have other things that are contributing to more stress through the joints, right? And then there's the middle ground where we're doing activity and we're active and we're exercising and we're doing our life stuff. And then there's the point where we can sometimes exercise more than what our joint capacity is and what our joint capacity allows. And I think that's important because my story is going to be different from the next person's story. So, there are some people that can run, 80 miles a week and take care of their families and not have much joint pain. And then there's the same people with the same makeup, the same age, like everything is almost identical. And they can only run 30 miles a week and they start getting joint pain if they do more than that. And so I think like we have to be sort of like almost what's the word? We have to be gracious with ourselves to understand that we are our own individual people and
Right.
everyone isn't necessarily the same. But I think when we talk about over exercising, that can look different for different people, but you can start getting more pain, right? So it's this really sweet spot that we want to be in, and everyone's sweet spot is different.
That's a great answer. And I mean, when you look at research, which I do a lot, I mean, it's you're still an N of one. You're still, the research can tell you what it is, but we are all still N's of one. I think that's really important to remember. I mean, I shared with you, in my email exchange that, I've seen research that sedentary people actually seem to have, and that makes sense given what you said, a higher incidence of these problems, especially in their hips and knees, than recreational runners. But then once you go into like elite competitive runners, there looks like a bit of a reverse J curve going on there, which you see in a lot of the literature when you talk about health and activity versus Ironman triathletes versus, yeah,
Absolutely. I think like when, you're more sedentary, I think not only, we talked about things like weight gain, but you tend to, have, there are also like nutrition and other things that may be contributing to that as well. I think, also when you're asking your muscles and joints to do stuff outside of the daily living stuff, they're deconditioned, right? They're not
yeah,
activating, they're not supporting your joints, even when you decide to do exercise. So I know a lot of people who are sedentary and
yeah.
then they're like, okay, I want to start going to run or I want to start exercising. And they're really, it puts a shock to your body, right? Because you skip that middle point where you need to retrain those muscles and get all of the muscles and tendons and ligaments and all the things that support your joints activated and turned on before you then start engaging with exercise. And then when you get to the elite level, I mean, it certainly comes down to, how much wear and tear are you putting on your body, each year. And there is certainly a capacity for breaking down of the joints with high impact exercise. These are things like running, more than cycling, right? Running is more high impact than cycling. Swimming is, less impact. Those are like my lower impact things, but running is just it's a high impact thing. It's highly technical. It's more technical than people think, and it requires more muscle groups that are activating and protecting you. And as we get older, it's harder with those signals to those muscle groups and the strength of those muscle groups starts decreasing. So it becomes more difficult to maintain it. So it's easier to start running when you're younger than it is to start running,
Yeah.
when you're middle-aged or start running when you're older. Like these are different mechanics involved with that.
And that's why it's less forgiving when you get away from it. Everyone in our audience, well, most people who are not just true runners, but as a, multi-sport athlete, running is not my favorite. I like to do it in small doses, but like if I let it go for a while, I
Right.
need to ease back into it to get those joints back
Correct.
to
Correct.
being like, yeah.
It's a
Um,
retraining.
where does strength training fit into this picture then?
So, I think strength training is really so I think about strength training. So some people think about strength training like this. They think, okay, I'm training for something, right? I have an event. I have a thing, the competition coming up. I think about strength training for injury prevention, right?
Mhm.
And so there are many people who say, oh, I don't need to do strength training. I play tennis 7 days a week.
Right.
I play, I go running, 7 days a week. or I go do something else. But all your body knows if you're not strength training is I'm doing my normal daily stuff and then I'm competing at a high level. But that middle grounds where you are actually like training in building endurance for those muscles, that's different than performance endurance, right? So it's like it's hard to just go from daily stuff to now perform, right?
Yeah.
It's like we have to, because that breakdown that happens when we're performing at a high level, we can actually prevent some of that breakdown or slow some of that breakdown if with our support from strength training, right? And our big muscle groups. I think about, some people ask me like, what are the muscle groups we want to really have that support? So if I think about the lower body and lower body injuries that I see, having really, really strong hips, right? And specifically the posterior hip, the backside of the hip. These are our hamstrings. These are our glutes. Exercises dedicated to keeping these muscles strong, protect the knee joint actually, and protect the hip. And actually protect your gait and your posture, which then protects the ankles, right? And your whole running cascade, right? So that's like if you only have time to do strength training, for lower body injury prevention and to slow this degenerative process, this wear and tear process in our lower body, it's strength training in the hips. In most women, this is just how we're made. We're more front leg dominant, meaning our quads are super strong. We have the best quads that anybody has ever seen. Usually the backside of our hip, our glutes, our hamstrings, and these are our workhorse muscles. We are usually underutilizing these muscles almost across the board in all women.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great advice. And that also makes me think of research that I've seen actually in cycling too, about how form breaks down when your core kind of falls apart, right? Like, you want to keep all of you strong, because if your form starts breaking down, that seems to me that it's not as good on your joints.
Absolutely. And and you brought up a great point of core. So it's like hip and core would be my two
Yeah.
things. And core comes immediately after that, or even right next to it, because I've now supported my entire trunk, right? If I have a strong core, I have a strong back, right? If I have a strong core in hips, I have now strong supportive knees and everything below. And so that really is like, those are the injuries that are going to keep people from doing these high intensity type of workouts, these ultra marathons, these really, really high endurance activity. Those are the things that keep people with resilience and getting recovery to be able to keep doing those things.
Yeah. And that seems to feed into, when I got back into my like sort of half Ironman training last year, I definitely made sure I went back and actually did the mobility stuff that I talk about you should do,
Yes.
and I don't always do, because I find personally any little imbalance will show up in my knees. Like, I can, as soon as hips get tight, my knees start talking to me, right? So can you talk a little bit about like where you see mobility work fitting into the picture as far as joint health is concerned?
Yes. So this is actually this is something I talk about almost every day in clinic. So hip mobility is huge. And as we are wearing down our joints, right, we start losing range of motion in our joints, right? So as the cartilage breaks down, our joints get a little stickier, they get a little stiffer. So you'll notice that you used to have this much motion in your hip and now you only have this much motion, right? And that's kind of that breakdown of the cartilage process. And I think the important part to think about is, let's say I'm running, right? And I'm going to give you an example. So let's say when I'm running, and I'm just giving an example, I'm using 120 degrees of range of motion when I'm running. Let's just say my hip is at 120
Okay.
degrees. So that means as I'm running, I have a full 120 degrees and all the muscles supporting me have that amount of room to work, right? And my joint is getting forces across 120 degrees.
Okay.
Now, when I lose range of motion in my hip, and I don't have that good mobility, I only have 90 degrees, right? Which means that the joint forces that are going through are across 90 degrees and not spread out as wide, which means you
Interesting.
have more focal and more, direct impact into the joint and less ability for that muscle support because you're not using the full
Wow.
range of your muscle support, right? You're only using 90 degrees instead of 120 degrees. So, it's almost like if I spread load over a wider range, I'm not going to feel it as much at any one spot, right? It's going to kind of be spread. But if I lose that range, now it's more focal in certain spots. And I think that's what really can progress the breakdown that's associated with arthritis as well.
Oh, wow, I love that. I really love that because I've always preached it from sort of the other end of when you have that 120 degrees, you can access your muscles and access more force. But
Yeah.
like it also makes sense from that perspective, which I had
Yes.
never even crossed my mind.
Yes, it's same. I mean, we're saying the same thing, right? I mean, you're talking about muscle recruitment and accessibility and activation, and you can't access a muscle that you can only get at 120 if you're at 90, right?
Yeah.
So, if I need 10 muscle groups supporting me when I'm running, it could be the difference between only 5 or helping you at any given time, right? If you don't have that range of motion and you can't get the full work of the 10. So,
Is there any kind of do you recommend like mobility every day? I mean, where do people fit it in an ideal world?
yeah, I think, this can change a little bit in our lifespan, right? So I think more mobility becomes more important as we're aging, right? So I would say I would say late 30s, 40s, mobility starts becoming a little bit more important. And I'd say at minimum on the days that you're exercising, there should be some attention to, stretching, making sure, you have your muscle groups warmed up nicely and not just going to perform. When we're young, we're like, great, I'm going to go play. I know I used to say, I'm going to go play pickup basketball. I can just show up and just start playing and it's largely going to be fine. There's going to be
Yeah,
no consequences. And unfortunately, there will start to be consequences as we age to that, but it's only a matter of us taking a little bit of time on the front end, right? And having that attention to detail and just saying, okay, I know my body's changed. Doesn't mean I can't do the same things that I used to do. Just the way that I prepare is different, right? And so that's what I'd say. Minimal on the days that you're working out, spending a little bit of time on mobility, stretching, before you're really getting into a workout. And then I know people that take, I really like, impact stuff, but then I'll do like a yoga day. I'll do a Pilates day. I'll do a, bar day where I'm really working on individual activation of muscles and individual stretching of muscles, and that kind of keeps me ready for the heavy endurance stuff, because you can't really think about, I want this muscle to do this when you're out running. You just do it, right? And
right.
you hope that you train your muscles well enough to do it, and that's your goal, so you don't have to think about it.
And so what I've also just heard isn't because I was going to ask that question, impact is good for our bones, and women in this demographic hear that. But there's also like you again, I think there's what I hear you saying is there's a sweet spot between impact and non-impact that we should try to hit, as well as possible.
Certainly. I think, when I think about impact loading, we're basically breaking down bone, and we're actually creating the process where we're building it back up. And that bone turnover process is actually healthy. It's a healthy thing. If we're not exercising enough and we're not getting enough impact exercise. So if I would be concerned if someone is, the aging athlete who only swims, right? And
Right.
isn't doing enough land exercise because they're not getting those stresses through the bone that they need for bone turnover, which keeps your bone strong, right? And then unfortunately, if we're exercising too much sometimes, and how your body lets you know that can be different. I mean, we have genetic factors that, make it where we have weaker bones, right? Osteoporosis. There's some things external, factors that we can't control, right? And then the controllable factors, though, I feel like, we just need to we kind of have to know our own bodies. We kind of have to know our own risk factors, and that's going to look different for everyone. But sometimes we're breaking down more bone than we have time to build back up,
Right.
or we're working out 7 days a week and we don't have a rest day where we get some bone turnover, right? Where our bone can like build back up. And so if we're breaking down more than we're building up, that's where we get in those situations where now we're talking about, bone stress injuries or stress fractures, right? And other ways that our bones tell us, hey, we needed more recovery time than we were getting. And I think as we age, I mean, our peak bone health, the peak bone health for us, age 18 to early 20s, okay? So this is an important concept because, I'll get ultra athletes that come to me in their 40s and they have their first, stress fracture. And they're like, no, my bones have been perfect my whole life. And then if you track back to their teens, they're like, well, I was kind of, maybe my diet wasn't great, or maybe, I was overtraining and I knew it. And, sometimes that present as, I missed my cycle for a month or for
Right.
a year. All right. There's a lot of different stories. I wouldn't keep, I spent, 5 years being a vegan, but I didn't keep up on my protein and my nutrients. And so you get these stories, and then these all come up though in our 30s and 40s. This is when it starts presenting, because you start having this downslide of bone health starting after your early 20s. And so, yeah, it's going to present about a decade later. And so all of the choices we make when we're younger actually will reflect, because if that's our peak bone health, then we won't have stronger bones than we have then. They will
Yep.
only start getting weaker. And so the importance of protecting them becomes even more important. Definitely more
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. I mean, and I talk a lot about like the slide that happens at menopause when you're
Mhm.
talking about bone health.
Yes.
It's
Two
not to be
slides, I would
ignored.
say. Yeah. So like that, that slide at menopause for sure. And then, as we're coming into this space where we're starting to our activity level has changed, and or it's maintained at the level we were in our 20s, but it feels a little different when we're 30 and 40, right? And then that menopause aspect also gives us a little slide too. So that there's like a mental slide that happens when we're like, okay, my body's just a little bit different than it was in
Hmm.
our 20s. And you start kind of picking that up in your 30s and 40s, it seems. And then, then that slide after menopause, right? And you're like, okay, now things are quite a little bit different. And so yeah, and that can present with this joint pain that we were
Hmm.
talking about. Yeah.
I want to talk about menopause specifically for a second and women's special risks, but I also want to talk about pain a little because I went to a pain seminar that was really fascinating and I saw images. Actually, like it looked like that person shouldn't be able to get out of bed, and that person had no pain. It was like an old hockey player, and that person was fine. Did
Yeah.
not look fine on the
Right.
X-ray, but was fine. But then they would show images of other people that you'd be like, huh? And they had crippling pain. So what is that about? And like where, if you already have arthritis that is bothering you, what pain, what's good, what's okay, what's acceptable, when should you pay attention?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, arthritis is so weird and pain pathways are so weird, right? And they're weird because I will have, and you totally just said this exactly the way that I see it in clinic. I'll see someone with bone on bone arthritis. There's no way, like you look at this x-ray, you're like, there's no space anywhere. Their cartilage was gone years ago. Like you have no idea. And they're like, yeah, I just ran the New York marathon. I'm gearing up, like I'm really, I got another one before the end of the year. And I'm like, great. Did you have any breaks in training? Were you able to just keep, they're like, yeah, I just trained through. It's incredible. Our body has an incredible capacity for compensation. And so we can never, never, never just treat an x-ray, right? So
Right.
x-rays are a guide. They're a guide. They're like, okay, this person has arthritis, right? Like that is what's going on. But how people present can be so variable. Pain pathways are weird. Sometimes people have, I mean, I've seen people in debilitating pain with a very, very minimal beginnings of arthritis where they can't not run, right? And we try all sorts of things. We can't get them back to high impact. And then I see these people bone on bone. They got some stiffness in the morning, but when they start moving, it's totally fine. Like they do more exercise than, the 20-year-olds that come in. So it's interesting how our brain pathways work, and controlling pain can be different. That's why we try to take an individualized approach to these things, right? So it's not a one fit all model. When people come in and they're like, all right, how do I manage my joint pain? We got to break down how much is this bothering you. I could tell you all day that you have severe arthritis and that people with this picture can get a knee replacement, right? I could
Hmm.
totally tell you that story. But if you're functional and you're doing all the things you're that you want to do, I can't really tell you that you need a joint replacement, right? I can't really tell you that. So it's like we treat the patient, not the picture. Pictures
Yep.
are a guide, and pain is not always, it's tricky. And it's so you need to validate people for where they are, because everyone's experience on this is going to be a little bit different. But it's interesting, like we do studies all the time where, there's studies out there where it's like, okay, I did an injection on someone's knee with like normal saline, which we think about as like a sham. It's like
Right.
salt water, basically nothing. A person gets 3 months of benefit, right? In knee pain. And then let's say they got a cortisone in their knee and they got 2 weeks, right? So how can that be explained? I mean, something
Right.
about the redirection of their pain pathway, the salt water was able to affect, and the steroid wasn't. And there's no way we can we don't know a way right now how we can identify which patients are going to respond to what. But I think this is that idea of that's why we have so many different treatment options for people for joint pain, is because no one thing is going to help everyone. So I think that's important.
Is there a message on how, and I know this is really hard to qualify too, but we do have these pain scales. When I go in to see someone like you, often I get a little chart 1 to 10, there's a happy face and a very unhappy face at the
Yes.
other end. Like, is there a place that I would expect is okay and I can work through it and maybe it'll abate. And then is there a place where it's like, no, this really, you should talk to somebody?
Yeah, I really like to use the next day rule. And the next day
Oh,
rule is, where we say, all right, is my pain more than 3 out of 10 consistently
okay.
during an activity, later that day, or the following day? So a lot of times patients forget that the next day, the pain that you're feeling is from what you did the day before. So they
Right.
say, "Oh, I ran 8 miles, yesterday. I felt great during the run. I felt great after. Like I was hanging out. I ended up going shopping after that, and it was fine." And then the next morning, I'm in, 8 out of 10 pain, right? And it's hard for some patients to draw that connection to say, actually, that is the pain and inflammation from the run, right?
Right.
Because they see those as two separate events. They don't see that as this is a continuation. And so what we know about inflammation is inflammation peaks, anywhere from 24 to 72 hours after activity. And so that next day pain is really important to pay attention to because it really is telling you how your body is responding to activity the day before. And so
Mm.
if people are following that next day rule, generally they're keeping themselves out of trouble, as I tell my patients, right? You'll keep yourself out of trouble if you listen to your body and you follow that next day rule. So less than 3 out of 10, 3 out of 10 pain, maybe 4 max with any activity later that day, the next day. That if you can stay within that, you're usually letting your body recover enough to keep doing the activity you're trying to do.
How important is adequate energy intake in that process? Like, how important is what we're doing as far as our nutrition influencing that next day recovery that you're talking about?
So, especially for joint health, we
Mm.
require, and we talked about how we need our muscles, our ligaments, our tendons, all these things need to be activating and protecting our joint, right? And so, when I think about nutrition, I think about things like, making sure you're getting, adequate vitamin D intake, right? Adequate calcium intake. And there are recommendations for this online. They're pretty widely spread now where you can see your expected, and this changes as we age. And so, our requirements differ, but making sure you're getting that. And most people, if they pay attention to that, can get enough in their diet, but some people don't and they, supplement. And that's something your primary care doctor can check on as well. People that live in like Seattle, I used to live in Seattle, high vitamin D deficiency out there, right? Because there's not a lot of sun. And so people need to factor that into their training as well. So vitamin D, calcium intake. But in addition, just making sure you have, high protein foods, making sure you're really taking care of yourself with recovery, right? So for joints, you need the right nutrition and you need to be taking in more calories than, or at least the amount of calories that you're burning. So a lot of times people are exercising a bunch, but they forget that they also need the food intake for at least that amount, if
Hmm.
not more, right? To further tissue recovery, because with tissue recovery, then the supporting cast that help our joints are able to recover and function the next day, right? And therefore our joints are happier because they're supported. When we stop having that tissue recovery, if we're not getting adequate energy intake, then we do see things like stress fractures and other deficiencies in bone that may not have happened if we had, adequate nutrition. The other thing is iron that some people forget about. So making sure you have good iron intake. These are like leafy vegetables, and if you're, vegan, vegetarian, and don't, have a lot of chicken and protein in your diet, like red meat, then that's okay.
Hmm.
Having fish if you're a pescatarian, making sure you're getting a lot of fish in your diet, again, leafy vegetables, these types of things are going to help you get more oxygen to your tissues, right? So iron is part of, the oxygen iron complex that attaches the red blood cells. And we know that blood flow helps us recover and heal, right?
Right.
And so with making sure your iron is adequate, we're helping that oxygen iron complex that allows our red blood cells to get where they need to go and do work. So that iron is also important as well.
Yeah, and for anyone who's wondering if that can actually, I think people sometimes underestimate the importance of what you're just saying.
Right.
But I hear all the time, and there's this woman, she just sticks out in my head because she took up figure skating again at 48, after like this giant hiatus. And she kept like not being able to recover, and it was, sore all the time. And she just upped her protein, and now she's like working on double axles, and it's
Yes,
amazing.
insane amounts of stuff, which is like awesome. But protein is like, I mean, our protein intake needs to increase as we age. and
Yeah.
especially in women. And one of my colleagues here, Heidi Skolnick, wrote a book about this,
I had her on the
right?
show. Yes.
And you know, she's like, hey, I know, and I was just having this conversation with my mom. My mom's like a super athlete, you know, like plays a lot of tennis. It was, you know, and I'm like, how much protein are you taking in? She'll have like a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I'm like, you're gonna feel amazing, number one, like as soon as you start taking in protein, but your body's gonna be such a so happy with you because the capacity to recover is gonna be, you know, astronomical compared to what it is right now for you. So yeah, protein's huge.
We also hear, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Man, sugar is like the devil out there, right? I mean, that's all we hear about is how
Yeah.
it's the devil literally with a fiery pitchfork,
Right.
that's just
Right.
like so talk a bit about the inflammatory effects of like refined carbs. Obviously, if you're running a marathon, if you're doing this stuff, you're taking that stuff in during what you're doing. What should we know about that?
Right. I think when I think about, you know, carb intake, preparing for something versus general carb intake, these are a little bit different, right?
Mhm.
So as you're, you know, preparing for an event, okay, I'm training for a marathon, I'm gonna get a good carb intake in the couple days leading up into the race. I think this can look like, you know, these can be a little bit more like, you know, not as much whole wheat pasta, not as much, right? But really getting the just carbs in, right? Because that's what you're really going to be using. And I think you can be less specific with type of carb then. But I think for general maintenance, you know, whole wheat is just generally better. It's more digested. We're getting generally more nutrients than just and less of the sugar content because the sugar is really not helpful. And the sugar, as we know, is inflammatory, right? And so, you know, there are many, and I think there's actually great data for, you know, anti-inflammatory diets. There's great data out there, and they're pretty widely accessible now. You know, different examples of inflammatory diets and the thought is, yeah, minimizing the things that are causing the inflammation. And if you think about it, you know, as we age, we have to do more of the things right than
Right.
wrong. Right. And so when people are like, well, if I do the inflammatory diet, it's just going to make me, well, that alone is not going to make this where you can, you know, keep running into your 80s. But that is one piece of this puzzle. And as many pieces that you can put in, the
Mhm.
more resilience you're going to have as you're trying to do these, you know, high impact things, you know, going forward. So I think sugars in general, I think being, you know, intentional about, you know, the sugars that you're taking in, but again, like whole grains, whole wheat, these are much better for recovery and are contributing in a positive way to your energy availability. I think, you know, that aside, I'm ultra, you know, training, I'm getting ready for that race or I'm doing, that can look a little different. And I
Yeah.
think your body is welcoming any carbs at that point, and certainly that's fine. But I think just for longevity and the overall picture, that's kind of what I would say.
Excellent. Let's talk a bit. I want to ask about supplements and shoes and some stuff, but I want to know before we leave this general topic, menopause. Sometimes in the literature, I'll see that one of the earliest things that women will present with, is this menopause related joint pain, this all over pain. Is that strikes me as different from osteoarthritis, but it also strikes me that you might not be able to tell the difference.
Yes, I think there is some overlap for sure.
Okay.
But I also think, generally speaking, there are exceptions to this, but generally speaking, this presentation in clinic will look a little bit different.
Okay.
So people tend to, you know, people generally don't present with a change in activity level, right?
Right.
So the people that are coming in with the, you know, I got these, you know, my hormones are changing and this is causing joint ache. They're kind of like, yeah, I'm doing my normal routine of stuff and this is coming out of nowhere, right?
Right.
That's generally the story. The other thing I find with these people is that their pain and discomfort on exam is generally out of proportion to what their x-rays show. So usually, you know, you may see a little wear and tear, a little bit in the joint, but nothing to the extent, and it's not limiting them to the extent that it actually is in their life. What you see on the x-ray is not aligning with that. So there's like a disconnect there. And then I think when you really, really get the history down for people, and I usually ask them, you know, what age did your mom have, you know, menopause? Like trying to, you know, how are you still having cycles or have those, you know, are they less predictable now? So getting a little bit of that history can tell you a little bit about things. And then people generally have pain in more than one joint. So
Right.
rather than, oh, I just got this knee pain or I got this,
Right.
they'll kind of, I see these laws of symmetry where they're like kind of like both knees suddenly started hurting, or both hips suddenly started hurting, or, it's not just like, oh, my right knee hurts, right? And you do see cases like that, but generally you'll kind of see it and they're like, well, yeah, now my kind of shoulders are hurting now and they never really hurt before and I can't really account for it. So I see like multi-joint presentations, and people will say, on any given day, maybe my right hurts more, maybe my left hurts more. And it's that, like, it's a little bit more unpredictable. And as you know, like we know, as much as we try to strength train and all these things, we're usually one side dominant, right?
Yeah.
I'm right side dominant. So, it's the forces going through my joints at any given time are gonna be, if I have a real arthritis, problem like that, I'm gonna have more on one side and it's gonna be pretty consistent, right? Rather than
Right.
both. I mean, that's generally how that presents. So those are the kind of history things that I find when I start thinking, okay, this is more of a, this seems more of a hormonal change, menopausal type of joint pain. And so that kind of tips my hat on that. And, for patients, it is hard to determine. There's a little overlap between them, but that's generally how I will see it.
And how do you address that?
So I think, after that history, and I'm like, okay, let's say we're in this, we're in this premenopausal, we're moving, our hormones are changing, that sort of thing. Then I generally have people, follow up with their primary doctor. They'll sometimes get some tests to just kind of confirm that, right? I've seen like rare cases like people had viruses that are lingering around and causing joint pain, right? Or people have kids who gave them, but kids give us, all sorts of stuff. They have a little virus that's causing it. It's not necessarily menopausal, but it can feel the same, right? So
Right.
really it's kind of like getting that validation. Okay, this is a hormonal change. This is kind of what we're managing. And then we say, okay, how bad is it bothering me? How debilitating is it, right? And, as you know, there are hormonal supplemental therapies that
Yeah.
people will take, right? And I think that's up to the individual person. And as we know, there are risks with supplementing hormone, right? That supplementation of hormone, when our body is trying to wean down on our hormones a little bit, can confuse the body, and puts us at risk for other health problems, right? And so it really does, like, it requires monitoring from a physician, but you do want that definitive diagnosis before you're starting to do supplemental therapies and things. And sometimes people are like, well, it's manageable. And it usually does self-resolve, like it really does. And it's more of like controlling inflammation with diet. It's more of, some people choose supplements, which we can talk about, later. But, there are, let's just say an array of things that people can try, and not one thing works for everyone. So I've seen where I, have had someone see their primary, they're on estrogen and they feel great. I've
Yep.
seen another person who tries estrogen and it doesn't do anything, but they
Yeah.
try a medication that works on pain pathways. These are things like, that can sometimes double as antidepressants, like Cymbalta, and
Mm.
medications like that actually do very well with postmenopausal joint pain. So that's one category. I have a category of people that they're on supplements and they're happy, right? So there isn't a one thing for everyone, but I think we have to decide how much it's limiting people. Sometimes just knowing what's going on is all people are looking for. And then if we find that it's a little bit more than that, then we can kind of manage it. If it's multiple joints, I generally am staying away from, injections and things like that. It's usually you got to work on the whole body system. So that's like, I'm in physical therapy. I'm getting some reworking and some strengthening and support in these joints so that I can, make sure they're getting what they need and that they're stabilized throughout the day. And then an array of one of the other options I mentioned, or other ways to sort of address it. But definitely a different approach than if it's just arthritis type of pain.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I know supplements are always like a convoluted topic, but as you alluded to, there's definitely, I know women who have done super well with turmeric, didn't do a thing for me, but I had a arthritic big toe that sidelined me, was not able to run, and I started taking eggshell membrane and boswellia in this joint health supplement that I use, and it, like, literally I could move my toes again. And
Yes,
I was running, so, like, that's not placebo, that is, I'm not against placebo. This
right.
placebo, I'm still running, but, like, it seemed I had tried a bunch of things, and then this one thing actually worked, so I can't chalk it up to that.
Yes, it makes it tough. I think, I mean, you're right on. I mean, you tried some of the stuff, it didn't work, right? So I think this is why there's such a push to really empowering people to try different things, because it won't be, everyone's story will not be the same. And
Right,
so what I'd say about supplements is this. Most supplements have very limited data.
right,
I hear about glucosamine conjointin, right? And there's actually a little more, data for glucosamine than there is actually conjointin. But then together, there isn't much data, much
Right.
at all, right? And so I think, as long as people are being cautious with what they're doing, and in a lot of the supplements, I think the important point too is that there's a lot of other stuff in these supplements usually when they're getting sold, right? So it's rare that we can just get isolated forms of these
Yeah.
things. So I think it's important to read the back of the label to know what you're getting. And then I think it's important to educate yourself, about, making sure there aren't any, known side effects or, potential side effects or harms to taking the medicine. A lot of this stuff is natural, but it's important to educate yourself on that, because you definitely want to know if you're trying a supplement that has a lot of research behind it, or if it doesn't. That can kind of change your threshold for how long you're going to take it, and or there's also research on how long it might take for you to see a difference. And
Right.
that's important, right? So some of these supplements, it's like it's going to be 3 months before you notice anything. So if you take it for a couple weeks and you don't notice anything, you may just not be taking it long enough. So I think
Yeah.
the power of the internet, it's like I never discourage patients from looking on the internet. And a lot of times they're rattling off different supplements that I haven't even heard of yet.
Yeah,
And
I'm sure.
truly, they know more, a lot of times they know more about it than I do. So I make sure to be very, upfront about what I know and what I don't know with patients. I empower patients to educate themselves. I empower them to look for research on, these things to make sure they're safe, and then read the labels so you know exactly what you're putting in your body, and,
Yeah.
and know that, different brands of these things carry different additional products that may be in there with what you're looking for. I think turmeric, one of the studies I saw, the amount of turmeric you'd have to take to make a difference, is like pounds of turmeric per day. And, I have people that take a couple scoops of turmeric in their shake or do whatever, and they feel great. So you can't tell those people that they're not
Yeah,
better,
I see
right?
it too.
And it's not, it's just kind of like a do no harm. If it's not going to cause you harm, and it just may not help, but as long as it's not harmful, I think these things are okay to try.
Yeah, and I say that all the time. It's like equivocal doesn't mean it won't work for you. I mean, just because the
Right.
research, and I always send people to like examine.com, consumerlabs.com. I mean, there's some really good sites out there where you can read the research, get distillation, and find like quality supplements. All that stuff is
Exactly.
is doable. Yeah, that's great. Um, let's talk shoes. Like I had a running coach once that told me that the shoes that I ran in were great, but the other shoes that I wore like the other 10 hours of my life might have been causing my problem with like plantar fasciitis or whatever I was dealing with way back when.
Yes.
Um, I feel that gets overlooked a lot in the conversation of shoes. Like, what are your thoughts on that as far as our joint health specifically?
So a lot of my patients, I always tell them they are so specific and adamant about the shoes they go running in and their exercise shoes. And then the rest of the time they're just like, oh, I'll just put whatever on, I'm just in these old, 5-year-old shoes that, are not
Flip
supportive,
flops, whatever.
flip-flops or whatever, right? And so, again, it's like this, I don't want to be like this age, but yeah, like when we're in our 20s, we can kind of get away with doing whatever, right? It just like doesn't matter. And a lot of times we end up with these like bad habits that we don't even realize, but it starts to matter later. So it's like, let's say like, there's 3 check boxes that you have to hit before you're having pain somewhere, right? Well, if we don't have adequate shoe wear and we're not supporting our joints kind of all the time, you already have a checkbox, right? So then if we talk about, okay, now my bones are getting a little weaker as I'm aging, checkbox. Okay, now, I'm wanting to keep running X amount of mileage. So that puts more forces to my joints versus my friend who likes to cycle, checkbox. And suddenly we're in pain and we're like, wait, how do we get here? Hold on. So again, it's like the shoe wear is a piece of the puzzle, but as we age, we have less margin for error for not checking all the boxes, right? And
Right.
so, for shoes, I think, everyone has their journey as far as making sure they have the right shoes for their exercise. And there's a lot of resources now to like make sure you're getting the right shoes. And, there's several here in New York City, but like a lot of places you can go get the right shoe fit. But then what do you do for the other time? We commute for work. We do are you protecting your feet all the time? Do we have these like $350 pair of shoes that we go running in and they're like running on clouds, but then the rest of the time we're in these like, again, like flip-flops or some other shoes. So that really hurts your recovery. So it's this concept of like great. I'm really protected when I'm
Mm,
exercising. But then the bulk period that you need your body actually recovering, you're not supporting it. And that's more time than you were running, right? So you go run for 3 hours, but then you go walk around for 10 hours in shoes that aren't supportive. And none of the muscles, tendon, ligaments that are supporting your joints are getting to rest. So then all
yeah.
they see is like, I work really hard and I'm still working. And then, oh, it's time to run again. Uh-oh. And so again, this is where we start getting these overuse things, right? These tendonitis, these plantar fasciitis, these stress fractures, right? These other things where we're like, we got to support our feet all the time. As much attention as we put into finding that shoe for the sport or the event or the type of competition we like to do, spend that amount of time with the shoes outside of that. And generally your feet will be happy. Happy feet is like the start of joint support.
I could not agree more. I laughed out loud when a friend of mine started representing UFOs, those recovery sandals, and
Yes.
then she gave me a pair, and now you cannot pry them out of my hands. They are so amazing.
Yes. Yes.
I
And
was
they're
like, my legs feel
designed.
amazing. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, yes, exactly. So exactly, and yeah, if the in UFO sandals are not flip-flops, right? So like
Right.
these are
Right.
like very, very specific recovery types of shoes. Important,
Yeah.
very important.
How helpful are braces? You know, you see people with knee braces, and I mean, I think recover or walking poles are great when you're hiking because it maybe offloads some of the weird forces. But is
Yes.
that useful?
So I think so. I'll address the hiking pole just because the hiking is very dear to
Mm,
my heart. So it's interesting because a lot of people think about hiking poles as like a crutch. They're like, oh, this person couldn't do this without
right.
the poles. And I in some of my mountaineering trips that I'm training for, I'm carrying 50, 60 pounds, for many, many, many miles in preparation for this, right? And I'm always using poles, right? And even in my lighter pack days, I'm always using poles because on the downhill we are fatigued, right? We have just done a
Right.
big workout and we are tired. Our muscle activation, we could try to say that they're activating the same way they were going up, but they're not. And
Right.
usually, again, as women, we on the downhill is when our hamstrings and our
Mm,
glutes, we really need them activating to control our knee mobility and to make sure that we're having stability through our joints. And
right.
usually they're tired and they kind of don't want to do it some of the time. And so hiking poles ensures that you're actually maintaining some stability that's consistent as you're going down. So people will always say, especially people with arthritis or joint,
Yeah.
oh, the uphill's great, the downhill, no good, no good. And it's usually because they're not stabilizing on the way down and the muscles are fatigued. And that's just what happens. But I think whether you're carrying 50, 60 pounds up a mountain or not, hiking poles, and I tell people going down is the most important. And that will really save the joint forces going through your knees. And it's a difference sometimes between my patients hiking forever through their 90s and people having to stop hiking hills, in their 70s because they're like, I just can't get down after I get up. Right.
That makes so much sense.
So the poles are not a weakness, they're a strength. And in fact, I think smart people are using poles.
And that's when I usually eat shit going down the hill because I'm quad dominant as a lifelong cyclist. I
Yes,
realize this.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. And these pebbles suddenly become boulders. And
Yeah.
you're like tripping over them, right? And they're like,
Yes.
you didn't see them on the way up.
Yeah.
So there's that. I like them too. There are people that I have that I see in clinic, and I see a wide range of, people into their 90s, right? And they don't want to use a cane. They don't want to use a cane. They're like,
Yeah.
and they've had some stability problems. They have some whatever. And I'm like, just use hiking poles and walk around the city. Just use,
Yeah.
they're like,
Then
interesting.
you
And I'm
look like you're training
like,
for something.
hiking poles are cool. You're in training. When you have hiking poles, you're in training. You're safe. Like everyone, there's a in there, and it's unfortunate. There's such a stigma around
Yeah.
using canes and devices and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, hiking poles are a great way to use that as well. And then from a racing standpoint, I think there's a couple ways that people use this. So it's often mentioned, and we talked about it a little bit. This Q angle, right? So women have
Yeah.
wider hips, right? And because we have wider hips, it doesn't necessarily make our arthritis advance faster, but what it does is it makes it more likely that we develop this arthritis under the kneecap because the
Mm,
kneecap is controlled by the back of our hip, right? And our kneecap movement. And as we're active, our kneecap likes to slide around because it tries to line up with our hip, right? So it's constantly kind of moving because it thinks
right.
that's the point that it's supposed to meet instead of staying in line with the rest of our thigh. And
Yeah.
so, that makes it where, we're more at risk for the kneecap sliding around. So I think in people that have this like instability in their kneecap, or this under the kneecap arthritis,
Yeah.
it's really great to have bracing, because it can stabilize the kneecap. And even when your muscles are too tired to control that movement, and it keeps the kneecap in the center and prevents that sliding and that further, breakdown that's happening behind the kneecap. So I think it can like definitely help with the forces going through with that stability, right? So kneecap for stability, right? So I don't think about, braces like as like, it makes everyone's pain go away, but I think that specific pain. And I think if people are unstable with activity, even after things like physical therapy and things like that, a lot of people can get stability back with physical therapy. But for those that can't, they can wear a brace. And then we do have some specialized braces that, let's say you have more arthritis on the inside of your knee or on the outside of the knee. We have these braces called unloader braces, and
Mm.
they can help to unload the side of the knee where you're like close to bone on bone, or the bones are getting close to touching after the cartilage is worn down. So those are pretty specialty, braces. So I think it's an individualized thing where the braces can be helpful, but again, it has to be sort of an intentional approach, and you have to, I never say brace in lieu of doing physical therapy and strength training, right?
Right. Right.
But it is more of a supplement rather than a primary treatment.
No, I like that. And I like that weaving in that Q angle part and how that fits in. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think there's like a little bit of a proprioception element when you put something on too, like it's
Yes.
a little feedback.
Yes, totally. Brain is like, I'm secure, right?
Right.
And I had a patient say, I'm going skiing, a patient with arthritis. They're like, I'm going skiing. And I'm like, okay, go enjoy. And I was like, moguls are gonna hurt, right? Sometimes with the,
Yeah.
moguls are gonna hurt a little bit, but they're like, oh, well, what about my brace? Is it gonna prevent an injury? And they're not. I mean, unless,
Yeah.
and there are some braces that can, in theory, help control some forces that make it less likely for ACL tears and other ligament tears when you're doing things like skiing and stuff. But for the most part, braces are giving you that feedback to your brain. I'm safe. Knee,
Yeah.
you're safe, And sometimes that mentally gives people the edge that they need to feel like they can do the things they want to do. So that's a great point you bring up.
Yeah. Awesome. So I don't want to talk a lot about, I'm going to save it for the last because I've done whole shows on it. But before I talk about injections and surgery and when you need that, my mother-in-law ended up with kidney failure because she just popped ibuprofen like vitamin I for like most of her life. Can you
Yes.
talk a bit about like the use of anti-inflammatory and that kind of thing for pain and what the limitations are there?
Of course. So I think about anti-inflammatories as a short-term thing. And I always make a very definitive start and endpoint for patients.
Okay.
Generally, when we're younger, there's less consequence for this, but there always should be an awareness of this. So anti-inflammatories they're strong medicine. I think they're good for acute pain. And it really kind of, in healthy people, there's an exaggerated response to an injury or to pain. And so the way that we can kind of manage it is working on the inflammation that led to that pain. I always tell people, your inflammation has been there, and only recently did it get to the point where it hit the pain button and now you notice the pain. So anti-inflammatories are good because, by dropping the inflammation, you can build more resilience. So it's like, oh, I had this knee pain that happened after this, I skied or I did some activity. Well, anti-inflammatories can drop the inflammation, whereas people notice, they're like, well, I took 2 days off and it felt better. And then I
Right.
started doing more activity and then it got worse again. Well, the inflammation was still there. It was just waiting to tip over again. And so the anti-inflammatory builds more room for you to then recover from stuff and then, build a foundation. But I'd say, like, I don't put people in more than any like 1 to 2 weeks for any given time, because it can be damaging over time to the kidneys, to the heart, to the stomach lining, right?
Yeah.
And so there are many side effects that people have. And I think like it's a good medicine in short doses, for very specific purposes, like I just described.
Would icing is sort of like falling in and out of favor back and forth. For someone in that situation where they can predict they're going to have like that kind of inflammatory response, is it useful?
I think icing is useful. I think icing is good for acute injury. Again, what happens when we get an injury is there's this big, huge
Right.
response, inflammatory response. We just throw all this blood flow into that area to try to like, clean up the damage and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of times in healthy people, it's too exaggerated of a response, and we kind of overshoot. Our body
Right.
overshoots, and we kind of like that because it means we get better. But sometimes we can like dial that back to just a normal response. So by ice, it actually blocks some of the blood flow, right? Which then allows some like less of that painful damage to happen, right? And it's more of just like there's a cleanup process, but it's not as painful while it's happening, right?
Great
And
point.
so that it kind of controls that process a little better. So I like icing after acute injury. I think, you know, once things are 2, 3 weeks out, I think it's, you know, it may not be as helpful, but in the first week, 1 to 2 weeks, it can be very helpful.
But not necessarily prophylactically. Like, I mean, when I do a big race, I hate cold water with the strength of seven suns, but I will cold plunge just to like bring it down a bit because I know it's going to be bad.
Yes. So
Okay.
that is that's definitely a strategy. I've seen people do that before and for recovery after, right? Probably more for recovery after though.
Yeah.
And you just kind of like there are these general guidelines. We generally use heating to warm up for activity.
Yep.
We use ice for recovery, but that's not always the equation for everyone. So I think
Yeah.
it's kind of like a little trial and error, but those are the general ways that we use it. And for you, you're like, no, when I cold plunge and I drop that inflammation that's already kind of there all the time. And then people know that if they have kind of inflammation all the time, that for you will drop your inflammation. And now you got a little buffer room to do your performance, right? And,
Right.
and that works for you. And I think that's great.
Cool. All right. So the final question I have, I know we're running up at the top of the hour, is when do you know that you need to go to the bigger guns, like injections, even surgery? Like, when does that enter the chat?
Right. I think, you know, when people have maximized conservative care, which are all the things we've described in this, you know, in this talk, plus, you know, again, like going back to the physical therapy, making sure you're protecting your joints and have this strength foundation, right? There are people that do all of those things right, and they're still not getting quite what they want. So then there comes a point, are we trying injections or are we doing activity modifications, right? And most of my patients don't want to modify their activity, right? So let's say we have someone with arthritis, they don't want to modify their activity. Okay, then we try to work with that and we try to give them as much mileage on that joint as we can. So that becomes the goal,
Okay.
right? And everyone has different goals. And so then we say, okay, well, we have these things like steroid injections. I think about that as like a rescue medicine. I did way too much. I blew my knee up after this run. I cannot recover. I can't walk. Well, gosh, we went from running 80 miles a week to not being able to walk. Yeah, you know, I've tried my anti-inflammatories for a week. I'm not getting it. Okay, reasonable to try a steroid injection. It's going to work quickly. It's going to get in the system. It's going to do, you know, it's going to really get that inflammation down. But then the question is what happens after that, right? And sometimes when we have this underlying arthritis, our body doesn't want to forget about it, right? It's
Right.
like, no, you pushed me over the edge and I know that you did it. I know what happened. And so then we say, okay, body, can we get back to the level we were? Okay, maybe I dropped the level a little bit. Is that still work? If it doesn't, then we start talking about things like hyaluronic acid, which is like these jelly injections. They basically, it's a gel that we inject in the knee. It triggers so it gets rid of inflammation, but also triggers the body to make these lubricating cells that help to kind of lubricate the joint and kind of
Women use
attach.
it
Um,
vaginally in
yeah,
this
so
audience.
it's
Yeah.
so it's, you know, hyaluronic acid, like, you know,
Yep.
multi uses. And then things like PRP and platelets are basically where, you know, I put your blood into your knee joint, to try to get some, you know, recovery of that normal environment, right? Getting your body to kind of like attach to the cartilage, create a little bit of, kind of attach and like kind of help preserve that cartilage a little bit, build these little bridges to kind of stabilize the cartilage, and then get all those bad inflammatory cells out and kind of make a new environment. So it changes your knee environment. It will not regenerate your cartilage. It will not give you, there's no way to like keep your cartilage from breaking down or anything, like, you know, from a global standpoint, but it really is just like resetting the joint and getting you back to like a happy joint environment. It's like, yeah, we got a little arthritis, we got a little stuff in here, but I'm actually managing this. The body's not overwhelmed by what's going on. And that is what causes our pain, when it's overwhelmed by the processes that's going on. And our joints don't have great blood flow. So by giving it
Yeah.
some blood supply, and platelets have growth factors, which kind of help with that, it triggers a really nice reaction that can help people. So those are things. And I don't do that when people are bone on bone, because these injections generally don't work. So if it's bone on bone arthritis, pretty minimal benefit to any of these injections. But these are all things trying to give you longevity of your joint. And if those things still aren't working, so I think about the people that end up needing joint replacement. These are two sets of people. There's one set of person that comes in, they're completely debilitated, they're bone on bone. There's like no way, there's no physical therapy, there's no injections, there's really no amount of turmeric or anything that's going to get them where you want to go. You can generally identify those people off the bat, and you're not going to put them through years of this stuff. You just give them that joint replacement and their quality of life is immensely better. Second category of people are kind of the people who are have done all the other things. They've maximized everything that I've described, and they literally cannot get it done. And then those people say, okay, as we get joint replacements, it kind of limits your activity a little bit, right? So we say, all right, your activity will have to change a little bit. You'll have to do a little bit less high impact when you get a joint replacement. So then you figure out the best timing for that person. And some people hear that and they say, okay, now I'm ready I cycle half the week and now I run half the week. And that's my happy spot now. So that's when people usually try to find that happy spot again to preserve the life of their knee before needing a replacement. So, that's how we arrive to the replacement. It's not, I almost never am like, yep, I hear your story. That's what you need. It's usually there's a process to get there. And I know some people that just stop running or they stop doing like ultras, but they still run, right? And suddenly like they don't really, they don't really need anything, right? And they just live their life. So there's a huge benefit to some activity modification if you've tried everything else.
Excellent. This has been amazing. I thank you so much for your time. Is there anything that you wanted to address to our audience that we haven't talked about?
No, I think this is a great topic. It's an important topic, and I really like, talking about these things because I don't think we talk about them enough. And there's sometimes such a disconnect between, we're firing all these words, arthritis, all these things that, and we need to make sure we educate our patients on what we're actually talking about, what they can do, and how they can take ownership over some of this stuff, because it actually makes our lives either the more knowledge our patients have, the more knowledge they come into these visits with, the actually easier it is to partner with them and get them to whatever goals they're trying to meet. So I think the value of self-education is huge. And we as physicians need to make sure we're also doing that outreach and education. So I appreciate you having me, and I love talking about this stuff. So I could talk all day about this stuff. So thanks for having me again. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Well, that's our show. Come on back next week when I sit down with midlife health and nutrition specialist Val Schoenberg. We talk all about menopause and metabolism, and it's not what you'd expect. So come on back for that one. And until then, as always, stay feisty. You've been listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I'm your host, Celine Yeager. The show is edited and produced by the strong, talented, and amazing women at Live Feisty Media. Follow us on social media at Feisty Menopause, and please help us spread the word. Screenshot and share this episode on your social media channels with the tag @FeistyMenopause. Share the show with your friends, and please subscribe, like, review, and rate this show wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth and good reviews make it easier for other listeners to find. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay feisty.